Israel would be much wiser to just withdraw from the West Bank and create a state which anyhow will be dominated by Israel and Jordan on the other side. So rationally, it probably serves their interests to just leave, and that the main reason they're staying is for ideological reasons. And then other people argue there are rational reasons for staying there. So I think it's always, as a general rule, it's difficult to separate out the ideological from the rational motive. And the case of the United States, as everyone I'm sure knows, there's always this argument about whether or not U.S. policy in the Israel-Palestine conflict is determined by strategic interest or on account of the Jewish lobby. And I think there also it's very hard to separate out and prove one way or another. You can find instances in which the power of the lobby did prevail, and then you find instances where the power of the lobby crumbled when a U.S. national interest became clear. So I don't think these are clear-cut cases. I think arguments can be made, rational arguments, convincing arguments could be made on both sides, so I don't get hot under the collar trying to prove one side or the other. Yeah.
Is John Peters a real person, and did she write anything else?
Well, Joan Peters, according to Professor Dershowitz, in his last book, The Case for Peace, I destroyed her promising academic career. I would have thought it was her book, assuming it was her book, that destroyed her. I'm not sure if it was an academic career or career. She disappeared, though in one of those wonderful ironies which are revealing about the lunacy of American life on this particular issue. In February 2001, shortly after the Second Intifada and the public relations debacle that attended it, her book, From Time Immemorial, unchanged, unedited, was reissued and immediately became a bestseller. And if you go to Amazon now, actually her book is doing better than mine. She still gets 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars. They love it. One person complains that it's understated. I don't know how you can understate the fact that there were no Palestinians there. And things go merrily along. That's the strange place we live in on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Everyone knows it's a fraud, but it doesn't change anything because they just love that thesis. Yeah.
Israel's human rights violations and the claims of the Palestinian people to what is currently the Israeli state, what do you think is legitimacy of the existence of Israel?
Look, every country in the world has has a degree of human rights violations. There are, in Israel's case, as I said, there are some egregious characteristics, and it's also the longest occupation in the modern world. But I don't think that changes at all its legitimacy. Israel, it's a state like any other state in the state system, and the question of its right to live in peace with its neighbors is the same as everyone else's. And if we're honest about these things and we don't become fanatics and zealots and lose sight of reality, so during the Israeli invasion of Jenin and Nablus, it killed in the scores in each place. I think there were 21 civilians killed in Jenin. I think 30-something, or maybe more, civilians killed in Nablus. And then a little while later, the U.S. goes into Iraq, and it basically does to Jenin, and what was done to Jenin and Nablus, the United States does to Najaf and Fallujah. But now it's not in the double digits, it's in the triple digits. It's not the tens, but it's the hundreds who are killed. And that's a function of power. Obviously, the United States has much more power, both politically and militarily, so it gets to kill, in each case, hundreds of innocent civilians. So I'm not going to pretend that, Israel's is the worst human rights record in the world, but I think we should be honest about 2 facts. The record, A, is awful. B, there's a way to resolve the conflict. And C, we're financing it. And I think most people, if they knew the truth about it, wouldn't want to support that. That's why we're constantly lied to about it. Propaganda costs a lot of money. You know, these organizations invest a lot in the lies. And the reason they invest a lot in the lies is because they know that people, if they knew the truth, wouldn't like it. Otherwise, why waste the money? Doesn't make sense. Yeah.
How do you explain this strange coalition that we see now between American Jews, mainstream Jewish, and the fundamental Christians, who are, if you look at their theology, are basically anti-Jews? How do you explain this?
Well, I think there are two issues. You know, obviously there's a confluence of interests on some issues, you know, relating to, you know, the ideas of the Christian right about the Promised Land and so forth. But I think there's been a tendency recently to try to obscure the fact that the real problem is the lobby. You know, for the Christian fundamentalists, yes, they're pro-Israel, but it's not their cause. They have other causes. But there's an effort now to blur over it and claim it's not just the lobby, it's also the Christian fundamentalists and so forth. I don't really think that's true. You know, Israel is not Jerry Falwell's cause. Neither is it for Pat Robertson. They support it, yes, you know, for their own pathological reasons. They support it. But I don't think it's their cause. The cause is the lobby. Not the only cause. There's also the issue of U.S. strategic interests. But I think the idea that beyond the lobby, there's a force within American society working to that end, apart from strategic interests. I just don't think that's true. You see who causes all the trouble, you know, who tries to block publication, create all sorts of difficulties on college campuses, prevent people from speaking and all of that. It's not the Christian fundamentalists. We know who causes the problems. Yeah.
So I think it's absurd, obviously, to exploit the Holocaust, but I think it's equally absurd to deny the existence of anti-Semitism, particularly when the Human Rights Campaign released a report saying that 2/3 of hate crimes in France this past year were against Jews, and I personally have experienced it. So I know that it's there, it's on the rise. One of my best friends from France tells me it's on the rise, tells me that they don't know the difference between Jews and Israelis. They think Israel's a leech on America. So I think it's equally unsafe to deny the existence of something that is targeted.
Okay, let's look at several of those statements. Number one, in every country in Europe, there is no dispute among any of the monitoring organizations that the main victims of bigotry and racism, including in France, including in Germany, including in the Netherlands, there's no dispute among any of the monitoring organizations that the main victims are Arabs and Muslims. That's not even a topic of discussion. So to claim that 2/3 of the victims in France are Jewish is just not true. There is no evidence for that claim. I'm sorry, I went through the record. There is not. Right, okay, fine. I'm telling you what I know, and you can disagree. I go through all of the reports. There's no evidence for it. Number two, there's a difference between saying there's no anti-Semitism, which of course there's anti-Semitism. In every society, there's anti-everything. You know, there's a lot of anti-short people, anti-fat people, anti-ugly people, anti-acne people. Everyone's society has anti. The question is whether there is a new anti-Semitism, a sudden resurgence of, as Abraham Foxman puts it in Never Again, he says, Jews now face as grave a threat, if not graver a threat, than they did in Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. Is there any evidence to support that claim? Or let's look at Gabriel Schoenfeld, the editor-in-chief of Commentary magazine. He writes in his book, The Return of Anti-Semitism, that there's a new phenomenon in American life. Now, he's talking about America, so we don't have to worry about far-off friends. He's talking about the United States. He says, there's a new phenomenon in the United States. Jews are targeted for murder in the United States. Now, there are Jewish people in this room. I'm Jewish. How many people feel like they're targeted for murder? That every time when they walk out of their dorm room or walk down the street, they are being targeted to be killed. Is this the real world? Use your own judgment. Reflect on it. I won't argue right now, friends. I went through the record, but look at the U.S. Do you think that you're targeted for murder? Do you walk on Yale University campus worried that at any moment you may be shot or lynched? Are you worried about the outbreaks of pogroms in New Haven? Is this the real world? Or is it a sheer fantasy being concocted for political ends? I can't prove it. Use your judgment. Yes?
It's been said of you intended as a compliment that you were the Jewish David Irving. I would agree with that. Are you proud of that characterization? Do you agree with it? Do you take it as a compliment?
I don't know really honestly how to answer that question. With all due respect, I think it's a stupid question, so I can't answer it. I can't. What do you want?
What do you think of David
I do. Okay. If you ask me what I think of David Irving, listen, young man, I can give you the politically correct answer and say he's terrible, he's this, and he's that. Personally, I don't like the fellow. I think he is a Nazi. However, I have to be fair, and I want you to listen. Fairness means, A, I'm not an authority on the topic on which he writes, mostly on military history on the German side during World War II. Number two, historians who are authorities on him give him mixed ratings. Gordon Craig, one of the leading historians on Germany in the United States, who writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, Gordon Craig wrote, his contributions are indispensable. I can't change that. I cannot say Gordon Craig is wrong. You know why I can't do it? Because I'm humble enough to say, I don't know. Craig, who writes for the New York Review of Books, says yes. John Keegan, one of the leading military historians in the UK, when he testified at the Irving-Lipstadt trial, he testified on his side, on Irving's side, as being a good historian. So I can only report to you what other historians have said. And so in the book In the Holocaust Industry, I wrote that Gordon Craig said that his contributions, his meaning Irving's, are indispensable. And that became, Finkelstein says Irving is an indispensable historian. Well, I didn't say it. And I just don't know. What I do know is that I totally hear, in this point, I totally agree, and I hope you'll listen. I totally agree with John Stuart Mill. I teach Mill every quarter of whenever I teach. I love Mill's On Liberty. And one of the things Mill says in On Liberty, he says that the most useful person in society in the trying to uncover ideas is the devil's advocate. Because the devil's advocate is always trying to find holes in your argument and trying to find errors in your facts. Now, the devil's advocate is a devil. That's why he or she is called a devil's advocate. But he or she serves the useful purpose of trying to find errors in your reasoning, errors in your facts. That is to say, as Mill puts it, he or she, even if he or she is a devil, he or she is trying to help you find the truth. Now, maybe his or her motives are evil, insidious, malicious, wicked, but it makes no difference. Because by looking for errors in your arguments, he or she is helping you, unwittingly no doubt, but helping you to find truth. And so I think, and I can imagine how it's going to be distorted, I think people like David Irving serve a good function in society. You know, I had a few months ago, for a film I was making with a British documentary, I went to visit Raoul Hilberg, the leading authority in the world in the Nazi Holocaust. And I talked to him about this whole issue of the Holocaust deniers, because Hilberg says, I think they're useful. They're good. That's the world's leading authority in the topic. And I asked him, well, how are they useful to you? And he says, you know why they're useful? He says, what makes them useful is they ask all the questions that everyone else takes for granted, that nobody else thinks to ask. So he says, everybody knows, he gives me an example, that in the gas chambers they use Zyklon B. And then along come these Holocaust deniers, and they say, well, we tested this Zyklon B, it can't kill humans. It can kill vermin, but not humans. And it was an interesting point, and then Hilberg says, well, it turns out they used Zyklon B, but they couldn't use it in its pristine form. They had to mix it. They asked an interesting question. And he says, I think they serve a useful purpose. And I thought to myself, if the world's leading authority, bar none, on the Nazi Holocaust is not terrified of these Holocaust deniers and isn't out to suppress them, who am I to say they shouldn't have the right to speak? And that's all I said. And I'll stick absolutely by that. Everyone, Mill says at one point in On Liberty, he says, even if the world is in the right, dissentients, those who disagree, still will probably have something to contribute to truth, a small piece. I think that's true. That's my view on the topic. In fact, I think among rational people, that wouldn't even be considered controversial. It wouldn't even be considered a controversial statement to let the devil's advocate speak. Who would even challenge that? Again, it's one of the peculiarities of discussion when we come to this topic. The level of mental hysteria it evokes is really terrifying. Yeah.
Following Israel's disengagement from Gaza, it's, Gaza has borders essentially, technically they're not borders, but on the south with Egypt and on the east with Israel, north of Israel, and along the southern portion with Egypt. Egypt actually took over monitoring between Egypt and Gaza, and there were thousands of people who went back and forth between Egypt and Gaza. There were lots and lots of weapons that were going through into Gaza.
I don't know how you know that.
Through. And, the rest of it, of course, what connects with Israel, every state in the world has the right to monitor its own borders. So I'm wondering,
I totally agree with that.
Let me finish my question, please. Clearly Israel isn't in control of the borders of Gaza. Doesn't that create a little bit of a credibility gap with all those human rights organizations that you said all agreed that Gaza essentially was remaining a prison under Israel control because Israel controlled the borders, and it doesn't control the borders?
Well, look, what you're saying is just factually untrue. You have it out that there's this...
Untrue?
Yeah, let me finish. I let you finish. I let you finish.
But
What's true, okay, and you know what? Listen to this. I apologize. I was wrong. I have no problem saying that. I was wrong.
Yes, you
okay? Fine.
And many other things.
Okay. Let's look at this particular question. You make it out that there's this constant traffic between Egypt and Gaza. No, there is not. There were 2 days, where Israel gave permission to the Egyptians to open the border. They're monitored by Egypt and the Palestinians, but they're not controlled. Israel maintains the uppermost control along the whole Gaza border. Nothing has changed. Zero. For 2 days, they opened the border. Now, you add a little fairy tale to it, all these weapons we're going through. Where you came up with that, it's a fertile imagination. It has no basis in any records. I followed what was written about it. Nobody claimed that. that Israel was allowing all these weapons to pass through. But let's turn to the broader question, the question which I totally agree. Every country has the right to control its borders. I think that's a very uncontroversial proposition. But let's put the emphasis on its borders. Israel has the right, for sure, to build a wall on its borders. But it doesn't have the right, in order supposedly to protect itself, to build a wall that takes a sinuous route, as the World Court puts it, around the settlements in the occupied territories. Again, among rational people, not a controversial proposition. Let's take a simple analogy. My parents, they didn't get along with their neighbors. Frankly, they didn't get along with anyone, including among themselves. So, at some point, they decide to build a wrought iron fence. They decide to build a wrought iron fence to separate their property from our neighbor's property, the Golds. Okay? In New York, at any rate, when you want to build a fence to separate your property from your neighbor's property, the first thing you have to do is you have to hire a surveyor. And the surveyor comes to check exactly where the border is between yours and your neighbor's property. And if you build that fence literally 1 inch over on your neighbor's property, legally they have the right to tear down the fence. Now, that proposition is not complicated, but then you begin to ask yourself a question. What happens if you're building a fence and you're saying you're building it because you don't get along with your neighbors? And then you build the fence, and the fence starts going around your neighbor's swimming pool. Well, then people begin to wonder, is this because you don't get along with your neighbors, or because you want your neighbor's swimming pool? Or in this case, the most fertile land in the West Bank. And then what happens if you build the fence so it cuts right through your neighbor's living room? Or as in the case of the fence, the wall they're building in the West Bank, that cuts right through the West Bank. Then you begin to wonder, are they building this structure to defend themselves or to drive the people living there to leave? And that raises altogether different questions. It has nothing to do with your right to protect your border. It raises an altogether different question. Your right to steal another people's country. And I'm sorry, I don't think that's very complicated. At least it hasn't been for the past century. You don't have that right. Yeah, I promised him.
Just a quick one. Unusually, I don't know the answer to this question. If the territories occupied in 1967 are considered illegally occupied or occupied territories?
No, it's a belligerent occupation.
Okay, whatever, right. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. But what about the territories that were conquered and occupied in 1948? Wouldn't they be equally illegal?
No. You know, the position of the United Nations has been that the law begins from the UN. You know, I can't now go into the technicalities of this, but the UN position has been that Israel is entitled to the territory it acquired in the 1948 war beyond the borders that were set by the partition resolution, and that the territories that were acquired during the 67 war violate the UN Charter. You know, you can make an argument that when Israel expanded from 56% to 77% of Palestine in 48, it was illegal, but the UN isn't taking that position, and frankly, I don't see any point in getting into a quarrel with international law. I think that the international law is not bad. It's not terrific, but it's not bad, and it's a good place to begin. If for no other reason, then most people are willing to agree with it as a place to begin. And once you start to try to change it, it becomes a much more complicated picture. So I say, stick by what the law says and work from there. But I agree, you can make arguments like that. Yeah.
Those of us who are involved in the anti-war movement or activists in it are constantly being asked to, on issues of unity, submerge the question of the right of return and or divestment in Israel. Or if not submerge it, suspend it entirely. I have a lot of problems with that from a moral point of view, although I understand their political point of view, which is to build a larger organization. But I just can't accept it personally. Curious to know what your own response to that would be.
My basic view is we should build on what everybody agrees on, because even that, we've not made any progress. The occupation has been going on for 40 years. Everyone in the international community agrees, all human rights organizations agree, that Israel has to withdraw from the territories it occupied in 1967. I think we should build on what we agree on and not argue over what we disagree on. Now, but I don't want to deny, because I see it. There are difficulties there on the question of the Palestinian refugees. All I could say on that particular question is that I think the Palestinians are quite capable of being reasonable. You have to give a reasonable offer, and then let's see what comes of that reasonable offer. I think people can resolve the conflict reasonably. But reasonably can't mean that you first expected Palestinians to renounce their right to the 77% of Palestine that became Israel. But after they renounce that right, now they have to renounce their right to more parts of the West Bank. They have to agree that Palestine will be divided into two. They have to agree to give up Jerusalem. They have to agree to give up their most fertile soil in the West Bank. They have to agree to give up their water. I can't see how any reasonable person could possibly accept that. And it's simply just way out of line with what the international consensus is, which is, as I say, it's just not even a topic of dispute. The territories, you are not entitled to any territory that you acquired during the 1967 war. That's just not controversial. So let's try to get agreement and let's publicize what's not controversial rather than argue over what is controversial. There's plenty of time to get to the controversial part. Yeah.
I've read several times that the Jews were kicked out of Arab countries at the establishment of Israel. This claims that it was done in huge numbers to try to equate it to what happened to the Palestinians. Is there any truth to any of that?
Well, look, it's a mixed picture, and frankly, there's not very good scholarship on the topic. If you look at what, for example, Avi Shleim, the Oxford professor, who happens to be an Iraqi Jew, he did a quite interesting interview a few months ago on the question. He was Iraqi Jew, and he was among those who left in 1948. And he's emphatic that they were not expelled. There are issues of property and restitution of property, but he says in 1948 what happened to the Iraqi Jews was not expulsion. And you have to look at it a country-by-country basis and see what happened. But I wouldn't make any broad statements about it. I think in some places the argument for expulsion is strong. In places like probably in Yemen and Iraq, it's weak. But I wouldn't make any categorical statements. But there are places plainly where they were expelled. I think for reasonable people. Though I would have to emphasize that there just isn't any really solid scholarship on it. And probably people are working on that now. Yeah.
Hi. So in the beginning of your talk, you were talking about, the entire ICJ ruling on the barrier. And you were talking about how, according to international law, every single Palestinian should receive compensation because their lives are significantly damaged because of this. And I agree completely. Every single Palestinian should get compensation because it's unfair. So I'm wondering, given that you think that, why you criticize Stuart Eisenstadt under the Clinton administration and people who work for Holocaust reparations, for people like my grandparents. I just don't see how someone who believes so strongly in one case, which I agree,
I think that's a very excellent question. I think it's a fair question. But I think there's a misunderstanding on the question. I was emphatically for compensation for the survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. I would have to have been because I worked for about 20 years trying to get compensation for my late mother. My father was compensated from the Germans. He had a monthly stipend, whatever you want to call it, from the Germans. My mother did not, and I fought very hard throughout her life to get the compensation. I think in principle the compensation is absolutely fair. But what happened in this case? Let's look at some of the issues. And I've written a quite long book on the topic. I can't summarize it right now. Let's look first at the question of the Swiss banks. The claim was that there was billions of dollars which Jews had sent to Switzerland during the Nazi rise to power, and that after the war, the Swiss banks refused to give back the money to the Jews who survived and their heirs. That was the claim. So, let's first get the record straight. Although separately from myself, I was unaware that the first person to attack folks like Stuart Eisenstadt was not me. The first person was Raoul Hilberg. In 1999, he was interviewed by several Swiss and German newspapers, and Hilberg said, quote, "For the first time in history, the Jews," that's his words, "the American Jews, are using the blackmail weapon." Why did he say that? Let's look at the basic facts. Number one, the Nazi Holocaust is occurring during a depression. It's the 1930s. Number two, most Jews live in the shtetl. They live in Eastern Europe. They don't have that much money. Remember Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof? If I were a rich man. He didn't say he was a rich man. He didn't say he owned a Swiss chalet and a Mercedes. No, he dreamt of being a rich man. Most Jews did not have money. Number three, as I'm sure you know, when you have money, it gets you out of a lot of jams. So those Jews who did have money, they managed to get out. That's what money does for you. And they then went to their Swiss banks and got their money withdrawn. So Hilberg said, if you look at the face of it, this claim, as he put it, I wish I could imitate his gestures, billions of dollars, he says, is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous claim. Number two, when you look at what the findings showed, there was a very exhaustive audit done of the Swiss banks. It cost, at the end, $700 billion. Yes, $700 billion. No, excuse me, take that back. $700 million, excuse me, getting late in the day. It cost $700 million. And, please, I gotta make that correction, $700 million. And the audit found that the claims that were made by Eisenstadt and others, for example, that the Swiss banks had systematically destroyed the records of Holocaust survivors in order to conceal the fact that they had kept the money, those claims were false. They were not true. Number four, on the record of the Swiss, on the record of the banks, it should occur to most people, if you're in Nazi Germany or in Eastern Europe, and if you're in Eastern Europe or Central Europe and you see a war on the horizon, the assumption is all the countries in Europe are going to sooner or later be occupied by Germany. So where do you send your money? You send your money to the US. A, it's across the ocean, and B, you have a lot of relatives in the US because many Jews from Russia and elsewhere went to the US. And so there was an interesting question. The question was, why weren't the American banks audited? Why the Swiss banks, but not the American banks? And that was a question I raised. Now, 5, what happens? It turns out subsequently, the record of the Israeli banks was worse than the record of the Swiss banks. And as we speak now, the Israeli banks, on whom an audit was finally done and was found to have kept several $100 million, as we speak now, nearly 7 years after the Swiss banks paid out $1.25 billion, for which there was no factual basis, the Israeli banks still refuse to pay up. Now, I don't see why Stuart Eisenstadt and his friends were so up in arms about Switzerland, but nothing about the Israel, let alone the United States. It's your country. Finally, there's this whole question of the Holocaust survivors. Who are they? They started after the Swiss, they went to the Germans, and they said, there are all these survivors of the slave labor camps, the ghettos, the work camps, all these survivors who weren't compensated. Well, factually, it wasn't true that none of them were compensated. My late father got the monthly check from Germany. The estimates are about 1/4 got monthly checks from Germany. But there was another issue, an issue which frankly began to irk me. And the issue was how the numbers of survivors were growing by the year. So now, if you check the records, they're claiming 1.5 million survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. Or 1.5 million. Now you have to think about what that means, these figures. If you take someone like Hilberger, Henry Friedlander, or Simon Wiesenthal, who recently passed away, you ask Wiesenthal, as he was asked in Austria, how many survivors of the slave labor camps, the ghettos, and the concentration camps, how many do you think are still alive? He gave a figure, I quote in the book, of 15,000. So Henry Friedlander, Raoul Hilberg, they said their estimate was that about 100,000 Jews survived the concentration camps, slave labor camps, and ghettos in May 1945. And that seemed perfectly credible, because I, growing up, always believed, having read the scholarship on the topic, that what the historians said about it was true. Namely, it was a systematic, methodical, assembly line, industrialized extermination of the Jews. Well, if it was systematic, methodical, assembly line, industrialized extermination of the Jews, where were all these survivors coming from? My late mother used to exclaim, if everyone who claims to be a Holocaust survivor actually is one, who did Hitler kill? Everyone you meet claims he or she was a Holocaust survivor. And what truly was happening was the numbers were being escalated, increased year by year, because unless you had very high numbers, you can't justify the demand for large amounts of money. If it's only 15,000 who are alive, then your demands for money, they have a limit. So the numbers kept increasing and increasing and increasing, and they had no relationship to reality. And my point was, this is Holocaust denial. Because if you keep increasing the number of survivors, you decrease the number of victims. And that's exactly what the Holocaust deniers said. It wasn't that bad. But you know what? I'm pretty old-fashioned about this. I think it was that bad. I think it was horrible. I think it was a colossal crime. And that's why I think very few people survived. And 60 years later, very few people can be alive. Because the average age cohort of a survivor was about 18 to 22. If you were younger or you were older, the Nazis wiped you out. They kept alive those who were young enough and physically able enough to work. So if you were 18 to 22 in 1939, you'd have to be in an age cohort of the mid-80s now. The average life expectancy in Israel is 73. Here it's about 74. In the Soviet Union, it's much lower now, but it was around the 60s. How can so many people be alive? And the worst part of it was, and the part I found personally most distasteful was, the money was not going to the survivors. It was going into the coffers of the Jewish organizations who turned it into a racket. And I thought then, and I think now, it's wrong to turn the colossal suffering Jews endured during World War II. I think it's wrong to turn it into a shakedown racket, blackmail. And I opposed it. And frankly, on most of the points I just stated, nobody disputes it anymore. Read what the Jewish survivor organizations have to say. I attended all of the court hearings in Brooklyn, New York, with Judge Corman and Bert Newborn and Stuart Eisenstadt. And at all the hearings, it was all the survivors, the Nahos organization, the real survivors, who kept saying, this isn't fair. We're not getting the money. That's not right. You used us. And I think it's true. And that's why I called it a double shakedown. They shook down the Swiss banks, they shook down German industry, and then they shook down the survivors. I think that's wrong. Yeah.
On the anniversary of your parents' demise, who were heroic Holocaust survivors, do you say Yahrzeit?
Excuse me?
You observe Yahrzeit?
I don't observe any out of respect, actually, to my parents, who were devout atheists. I don't observe the holidays. What can I tell you? You want me to invent something? Again, I can give you the politically correct answer and tell you about my deep religious devotion. I won't. I know my late mother and my father at the very end. Actually, it was 10 years ago yesterday that my late mother passed away, October 19th, 1995. A friend of mine, a Persian friend, a friend of the family, she went to my mother, and the last minutes, she started to talk about God, the friend. And my mother said, "Get away from me with God." Look, my mother's father was very devout. You can say close to a rabbi. And they became disabused of religious ideas during the war. And that's how I was. I didn't come out differently. What do you want? I'm not going to fake it. And I don't see what that proves. What does it prove? Do you think it proves I'm not faithful to their memory? Do you think it proves I'm dishonoring them? That I don't say Yahrzeit or whatever it is? Does that prove that? What is it supposed to prove? It's like this guy, do you consider yourself the Jewish David Irving? What really surprises me, I won't use the street language, kills me, is like the low level of the questions. the level of sheer ignorance and imbecility and the insulting nature of the questions. I gave a talk. I tried to dignify Yale University as best as I could. I think, every student is here. It's an honor, and I deeply respect it. And I tried to respect that. I gave facts. I referred to scholarship. I tried to be serious. And then what kinds of questions do you get? That's not serious. And that's the whole point of my lecture this evening. I'm trying to talk about the facts, but people contrive things, invent things, everything to steer you away from the facts, drag you away from the facts. Let's not look at what Amnesty says. God forbid what B'Tselem says. God forbid what Piketty says. God forbid what Human Rights Watch says. Let's talk about, do you say yard site when your parents died? I think that's pitiful.